dawn on the caldera rim, 6,000 feet above the sea and colder than that suggests. The wind comes up off the water, and it does not smell like water. It smells like stone, and the stone smells old. Below the rim, straight down, sits a lake so blue it looks painted, almost 2,000 feet deep. No river flows into it. No river flows out. When the fog burns off, you can see through the water for 140 feet, cleanly, into cliffs that keep falling. The people who have lived at the edge of this place for more than 10,000 years say something is beneath it. Not something dead, something waiting. They call the lake Giwas, a most sacred place, and they will tell you, if you ask them the right way, that the reason the water is that blue is because of what is buried underneath it. This is a story about that thing, and about the men who came later, with pencils and cameras and boat oars, and who wrote it down in a way that changed the story forever. Before there was a lake, there was a mountain, 12,000 feet high. That is roughly the height of Mount Hood, roughly the height of Mount Rainier, a stratovolcano in southern Oregon, part of the same chain that runs from British Columbia down to northern California. Geologists call what it used to be Mount Mazama. They gave it that name in 1896 at a ceremony on the rim with fireworks. And we will come back to that ceremony because it matters more than it looks like it matters. The people who lived in this country when the mountain was still a mountain had their own name for it. Actually, they had more than one. In the Klamath language, it appears in surviving records as Moyaina. In other tellings, Lauyaina, which translates as something close to the Mountain of Lau. And Lau, in Klamath cosmology, is the chief of the below world, the being who lives inside the earth. You already see the strangeness, because the name for the mountain, in the mouths of the people who lived at its base, contained the name of a being said to live beneath it, before geology existed as a science, before anyone knew what caused eruptions, before anyone in Europe had drawn a map that included this coast at all. The people who lived here already knew that whatever this mountain was, it had someone inside it. And around 7,700 years ago, that mountain came apart. It is difficult in ordinary language to describe what happened to Mount Mazama. The best comparison is to Mount St. Helens, which erupted in 1980. Most people alive today have seen photographs of that event. The column of ash, the devastated forest, the lateral blast. Mazama's climactic eruption was more than 40 times as powerful. It threw a column of pumice and ash roughly 30 miles into the atmosphere. The ash fell so wide that geologists today find it as a light-colored band in soil layers across most of the Pacific Northwest, into Canada, into Nevada, into Montana. When they need to know how old a layer of dirt is, they look for the Mazama layer. It is a clock. And when the magma chamber emptied, the mountain fell into itself. The top 3,000 or 4,000 feet of Moyaina simply collapsed, downward, into the hole where the fire had been. The peak that had stood there for hundreds of thousands of years became a bowl about 5 miles across and almost 4,000 feet deep. Over the next several centuries, rain and snow filled that bowl. There is no river entering it. There is no river leaving it. Every drop in the lake fell as precipitation. The water cycles, on average, every 250 years. That is what Crater Lake is. That is the geological answer. Now here is what happens when you put that geological answer next to the story that has been told out loud by the Klamath people for as many generations as anyone can count. Because you should hear both. And you should notice at the same moment that they are the same story. The people who told this story about themselves called themselves Maklaks in the Klamath tongue, or in some spellings, Maklaks. The word means simply the people. The Modoc, their close relatives, called themselves the same word with a modifier meaning people of the South. Together with the Yahuskin band, they are the three peoples who today make up the Klamath tribes, headquartered in Kiloquin, Oregon. They are still there. This is not past tense. There are more than 5,700 enrolled members today. They opened a casino in 1997. They run a language project. They hold their restoration celebration on the 4th weekend of every August. When I say the Klamath, I do not mean a people who used to be. I mean a people who are. But the story I am telling begins long before treaties, and long before casinos, and long before American maps. The ancients of the Klamath, the elders, told of two great spirits, Lau, whose lodge was inside the mountain, and Skell, whose lodge was in the sky. In some versions, Skell dwells on top of Mount Shasta, 100 miles to the south. In other versions, on Yamsi Mountain, closer to home. These variations do not weaken the story. They tell you the story is old enough to have gathered different tellings, the way a river gathers stones. For a long time, the elders said, Lau and Skell were not enemies. Lau could climb up through a passage inside his mountain and stand on the summit and almost touch the stars where Skell lived. Their followers could take the shape of deer and fox and dove, and would play together in the meadows. It was a world of exchange, below and above in relation. And then something broke. The stories vary here, and honestly, we should let them vary. In one telling that has come down through generations, the two chiefs quarreled directly. In another, Lao coveted something he could not have and refused to accept the refusal. In another, the humans in the valley displeased the Creator and the mountain answered. What every version agrees on is what happened next. There was a battle, a furious one. The chiefs stood on their mountaintops, and they hurled fire at each other. Red-hot rocks, as large as hills. The earth trembled. Landslides of flame swept down the slopes. The people who lived below fled into the water of what is now Klamath Lake, and stood there in it up to their necks and watched the sky burn. And then the mountain fell inward onto Lao, sealed him under. When the sun rose the next morning, Moyaina was gone. In its place, the elders said, was a great hole, and into that hole rain came for a long time, and it filled. And Lao, the chief of the below world, was underneath, is underneath, trapped in some versions, sleeping in others, watching in others still, but there, in the water, beneath. Now, here is where I have to be careful with my words, because it would be easy at this point to say something like, the Klamath had a legend that predicted the volcanic collapse, or their ancient wisdom knew what geology only proved much later. That kind of framing is condescending, and it is also inaccurate. The Klamath were not predicting anything. They were remembering. They were describing an event their ancestors had actually stood there and witnessed. They just described it in the language they had, the language of persons and relationships and consequences, rather than the language of pyroclastic flow and magma chamber collapse. But those two languages are describing the same afternoon. In the 1930s, an archaeologist named Luther Cressman went into a cave in Central Oregon called Fort Rock Cave. He was digging beneath a layer of volcanic ash. It was the Mazama ash, that clock I mentioned. Under it, in the dirt underneath, he found sandals, woven sandals made of sagebrush bark. When radiocarbon dating became available a decade later, those sandals were determined to be more than 9,000 years old, older than the eruption. There were more of them in later digs, going back over 10,000 years. The people who wore those sandals were the ancestors of the Klamath. They lived in this country. They walked on that ground. And on a particular morning, roughly 7,700 years ago, they looked up and they saw the sky fall in. The story you have just heard, the story of Lao going under and the water rising and the lake forming, is not a legend in the sense that word usually implies. It is a testimony. It is the closest thing anyone in North America has to an eyewitness account of a major geological event. It has been passed down, mouth to ear, for what may be 300 generations, longer than any European nation has existed, longer than most alphabets have existed, and it is accurate. Which brings us to the question this whole video is built around. What did the Klamath say was living beneath Crater Lake, not believe, said? Because in Klamath cosmology, the difference between believe and know does not sit where an outsider might think it sits. The elders said Lao was under there, and Lao was not alone. Lao had followers. They took the shape of animals the animals you might expect to find near water, and of some you would not. There is a story, still recorded on a National Park Service marker near the rim today, of a giant crayfish, a creature that lived under the water, and that would come up along the rocks and pluck people from the edge of the caldera and drag them down into the cold. This was not told as horror. It was told as instruction. Do not approach this lake carelessly. Do not go alone to a place where powers dwell. The stories were a border drawn in words around a real danger. There is another creature in another place in this region called Skamdi, an eddy in the Williamson River, not far away, where the Klamath said monsters lived. Anyone paddling through would tell you to be quiet as you passed over it. Not silly quiet, actually quiet. The way you would be walking across a bridge with someone sleeping underneath it. The Klamath world was not empty of persons who were not human. It was populated, densely, and Crater Lake, Giwas, was the densest place of all. Every rock had a story. Every cliff had a name. Lau Rock, the huge cliff on the northern rim, was the shape, they said, of a great firebird that had died in the battle. It is more than 8,000 feet high. When you stand near it, you can feel a strange updraft because of the shape of the cliff face. The wind seems to come up out of the lake itself. There was another practice, and I want to name it directly because it changes everything you have heard so far about this lake being forbidden to Klamath people. The Klamath went to Giwas. They went there deliberately. Young men, at the age when a Klamath boy became a Klamath man, would travel alone to the caldera. It was called a vision quest, though that phrase in English has been so worn out by tourism it barely means anything anymore. The Klamath had specific practices. described in detail by the ethnographer Leslie Spear, whose fieldwork in the 1920s recorded them from Klamath men and women who had done these things themselves. A young man would fast. He would climb the caldera walls, sheer walls in some places nearly vertical, in the loose volcanic rock that still comes down as rock slides today. He might swim in the lake at night. He might swim underwater. At night, in water that, even in August, rarely rises above 60 degrees Fahrenheit. He was seeking contact with the spirits below, not fleeing them, seeking them. Spear recorded the case of a Klamath man who had lost a child. In his grief, he traveled to Giwas. He entered the water. He swam. By the evening of that day, he had returned changed. He had become, in the language of his people, a kyoks, a person with healing power, a doctor, a dreamer. The lake had given him something in the depths. That is not a story about a place people avoided. That is a story about a place people went to on purpose, at great personal risk, because whatever was underneath it was not simply dangerous. It was powerful. It was the source. It was the place in the entire landscape of the region where the below world came closest to the surface. And this specific thing is what the men who came in the 1850s failed to understand, or refused to understand, or in some cases, actively rewrote, which brings us to the encounter. June 12th, 1853. A prospector named John Wesley Hillman was riding a mule up a long, sloping mountain. He was 21 years old, originally from Albany, New York. He had come west with his father 4 years earlier for the California gold rush. His pockets were mostly empty. His party had been chasing another party of prospectors, a group of Californians who claimed to know the location of a lost cabin mine somewhere in the mountains of southern Oregon. For weeks, Hillman's Oregon party and the Californian party had been playing what he later called a game of hide-and-seek in the mountains. Neither group would tell the other where they were going. Both groups eventually became so short on food they had to declare a truce and hunt together. They wandered into the upper reaches of the Rogue River drainage, and country neither group knew. They were lost, they were tired, they were hungry. Hillman offered to lead a small party to the top of the nearest peak to see if they could figure out where they were. He rode up the slope on his mule. He did not know what was on the other side. He said, decades later, that if he had been riding a blind mule, he would have ridden over the edge and died, because there was no warning. There was slope, and then there was nothing. A vertical drop of almost 2,000 feet, straight down to a lake so blue it took his breath. The mule stopped. Hillman looked down, and in the words he used, 50 years afterward, for a Portland newspaper, he had never seen a lake that blue. His companion, a man named Isaac Skeeters, said the same thing. They called it, at first, Deep Blue Lake. That was the name they carried back to camp. Nothing much came of it. Word of the discovery spread by mouth. Southern Oregon had no newspaper yet, but the story got tangled up in local Indian conflicts, and the party could not describe the location well enough for anyone to find it again. Hillman moved on. In 1854, in an incident he later told friends about, an Indian tried to steal one of his mules, and Hillman received a leg wound that would trouble him for the rest of his life. He eventually left Oregon, moved back to Louisiana, and lived out his years there. When he died in 1915, he had a bronze plaque at the rim of a lake he had seen exactly once. 9 years after Hillman, another party of prospectors, this one led by a man named Chauncey Nye, came upon the lake in 1862. Nye published the first written article about it in a small Oregon newspaper and called it simply Blue Lake. Nothing happened. It was rediscovered again in 1865 by a party of hunters working with road crews out of Fort Klamath. That was the visit that finally stuck. The name that ended up on maps was Crater Lake because of the visible caldera walls. Every time the lake was found, the people who lived at its base were within walking distance. Every time, and no one told anyone. There's a phrase you sometimes see in park literature, that the Klamath never mentioned the lake to settlers because they feared it. That phrase is not quite right, and I want to be careful with it. The Klamath did not fear the lake in the way a person fears something dangerous and wants to avoid it. They regarded the lake the way you might regard a cathedral where a funeral is happening. You do not point tourists to it. You do not casually announce its existence. You keep the sacred quiet. An early American report, later gathered by the National Park Service, quoted a witness who tried to ask the Klamath about the lake and got only silence. No one would acknowledge such a lake existed. We learned from a medicine man that this place was looked upon as sacred, and death came to any Indian who gazed upon the lake. That second half, about death coming to any Indian who gazed on it, is exactly the kind of sentence I'm asking you to hold in your mind carefully, because it is half true and half not. The Klamath did regard casual staring at Giwas as dangerous, but not because gazing killed them. Their kyoks, their spiritual specialists, went to the lake constantly. Young men climbed its walls, old men swam in it. The lake was not forbidden. It was regulated. There is a difference. The The people who wrote down these early observations understood one word, sacred, and translated it into a 19th century Christian assumption, meaning off limits under penalty of divine wrath. That mistranslation is going to matter in a moment when we meet William Gladstone Steele. Before we do, there is one more person from this middle period I want you to know. His name was William M. Colvig. In 1865, he was a soldier stationed at Fort Klamath. He was 19 years old. He was one of the very few white men in that country who had made friends with a local chief, an aging Klamath leader named Lalek. The two of them talked over months in a mix of broken English and Chinook jargon, which was the trade pidgin spoken across the Pacific Northwest. And Chief Lalek told the young soldier a story about a mountain that used to be there, and about the two beings who had fought over it, and about the lake that had come after. Colvig wrote it down. And then, years later on a river journey somewhere in the west, Colvig lost the notebook. He remembered the story, though, or he remembered what he remembered of it, and over the following decades, he wrote it down again, and again, and again. Once around 1892, once in 1912, once more in 1921, in a version that survives today because his grandson kept it. Each of those versions had come further from the campfire where the story was first told. Each of them contained more Colvig and less Lalek, and it is one of those later versions that became the version everyone thinks they know. Around this same time, other men were doing more careful work. A Swiss-American linguist named Samuel Gatschet spent months among the Klamath in the fall of 1877. He learned the language. He recorded stories from Klamath speakers directly in the Klamath tongue and provided word-for-word translations. He published his work in 1890 in a 2-volume book, and it remains the most rigorous linguistic study of the Klamath ever completed. An amateur folklorist named Jeremiah Curtin, whose day job was translating for the Bureau of American Ethnology, later recorded a large number of Modoc stories. Some of what he collected made it into a book called Myths of the Modocs, published in 1912, and much of it circles Giwas. These were the good faith versions, imperfect, filtered through the categories of 19th century American thought, but honest attempts to hear what the Klamath actually said. And then, in the middle of all this careful ethnographic work, William Gladstone Steele arrived. Steele was 31 years old on the afternoon of August 15th, 1885, when he first stood at the rim of Crater Lake. He had come with a friend, a druggist from Portland named John Breck. They had traveled by railroad to Medford, by stagecoach to Fort Klamath, and then on foot for 20 miles through timber and volcanic pumice. Steele had wanted to see this lake since he was a schoolboy in Kansas, when a newspaper article about it had been the wrapper around his lunch. He remembered the article. He had waited 15 years. The night before he saw the lake, Steele spent the evening at Fort Klamath, and this is where the whole story I have been telling you starts to bend. Because Steele, that night, sat around a fire at the fort and listened to a Klamath chief named Allen David tell him the story of the two great spirits and the mountain that had come down. Steele wrote things down. He would later say that Allen David had given him the tradition of its discovery. Steele had also been introduced at some point to O.C. Applegate, Oliver Cromwell Applegate, who was the local Indian agent, and who had heard similar stories from tribal members over years of contact. So Steele arrived at the rim already carrying a story he thought he knew. When he saw Lau Rock, the great cliff on the northern edge, the one whose shape had been called the Firebird in the Klamath telling, he recognized it. He wrote in his journal that he saw the Firebird. He was, in that moment, doing something interesting. He was seeing the landscape through Klamath eyes, using a Klamath image applied to a specific piece of stone. 2 days later, he named things. Wizard Island, the volcanic cinder cone that rises from the western end of the lake, the youngest feature in the caldera, formed after the collapse, became Wizard Island. Steele named it because he thought the peak looked like a wizard's pointed hat. The crater at its top he named the Witch's Cauldron. Other features got other names, borrowed loosely from European folklore. Phantom Ship, Devil's Backbone. Nothing on the lake, in the naming Steele did in that first visit, referenced the actual name Giwas. Nothing referenced the actual Klamath names for any feature of the caldera. Steele had heard the stories the night before. He had recognized the Firebird. And then the next morning, he had begun renaming everything, in the vocabulary of a Portland newspaperman who had grown up reading fairy tales. There is not necessarily malice in this. It might have been enthusiasm. It might have been the ordinary reflex of a 19th century American to imprint the language he had onto the land he had just seen. But whatever the motive, the result was that the Giwas he had heard about at the campfire the previous night was already being covered over, not violently, cheerfully. That is often how these things happen. Steele, over the next 17 years, would give the rest of his life to Crater Lake. He wrote almost 1,000 letters. He gave lectures. He haunted congressmen. He self-published a book in 1890 called The Mountains of Oregon, and in that book, I have read the passage in front of me. He wrote a single sentence about the Klamath and their relationship to this lake that has echoed in tourism literature for more than 100 years. He wrote, "There is probably no point of interest in America that so completely overcomes the ordinary Indian with fear as Crater Lake. From time immemorial, no power has been strong enough to induce him to approach within sight of it." Oh, read that sentence again if you need to. And now hold it next to the ethnographic record. Because that sentence is false. Not slightly false. Directly, factually, provably false. The Klamath had been approaching the lake for millennia. Their young men climbed its walls. Their elders swam its waters. Their spiritual specialists made pilgrimages to it. The man Leslie Spear, interviewed in the 1920s, the one who lost a child and became a healer, had swum in this lake. His grandfather had swum in this lake. There was a whole ceremonial practice, well documented, of visiting Giwas at times of grief. It was not avoided, it was honored. But Steele had a national park to build, and a national park needed a certain kind of story. If Klamath people had been using this lake for as long as anyone could remember, for ceremony, for pilgrimage, for training their spiritual practitioners, then Klamath people had a claim on it, a claim rooted in 10,000 years of use, a claim that predated every treaty, every survey, every deed. That claim would have been inconvenient for a Portland journalist trying to sell a group of federal officials on the idea that this beautiful, empty, awe-inspiring piece of American wilderness ought to be turned into a public park. So Steele wrote the sentence. He put the Klamath in the past tense. He described them as afraid, superstitious, incapable of approaching this magnificent thing they had lived beside for 100 centuries. And he made himself the discoverer, not of the lake. Even he could not manage that because Hillman had gotten there first. But the spiritual discoverer, the one who saw it properly, the one who understood what to do with it. He was aided in this, whether he intended to be or not, by William M. Colvig's evolving retellings of the Lalek story. In Colvig's 1921 version, the last one, the one written from the memory of a memory of a memory, the whole battle between the spirits is reframed around a beautiful maiden named Loha. Loha, in that telling, is the daughter of a Klamath chief. The chief of the below world falls in love with her. He offers her eternal life if she will come live with him inside the mountain. She refuses. He rages. He rains fire on the people. Skell defends them. The mountain falls. The lake fills. You can see, if you are looking, what has been added. The doomed maiden trope was not native to Klamath storytelling. It was a European stock figure, pulled from 100 19th century poems and paintings and tourist pamphlets, in which some indigenous people, somewhere, always had a beautiful daughter who was always turned into a rock or a river or a bird at the hands of some spiritual authority. It was a shape white writers reached for whenever they wanted to make a native cosmology feel accessible, and Colvig, writing from memory of a story he had heard as a 19-year-old decades earlier, supplied the shape, perhaps unconsciously, perhaps in good faith. But he supplied it. And then Ella Clark, in 1953, in a widely read book called Indian Legends of the Pacific Northwest, printed a version very close to Colvig's. It was that book, more than any other, that put the Loha story into the American mainstream. Textbooks used it, tourism brochures used it, national park signage used it. The Loha version became, for millions of visitors, the Klamath legend of Crater Lake. It is not. Exactly, a Klamath legend. It is a Klamath legend that spent 50 years passing through white hands. None of this is to say the underlying cosmology was invented. The two chiefs, the one above, the one below, were absolutely part of Klamath thought. The battle, the mountain, the fire, the trapped being under the water, all of that is real, recorded in Gatshe's careful linguistic work, recorded in Klamath texts collected by Muriel Barker in the 1960s, recorded in the memories of Klamath elders alive today. That part is not made up. That part is the actual ancient testimony of a people who lived through a volcanic apocalypse and encoded the memory in the shape of a story. What was added by the outsiders was the varnish, the doomed maiden, the heightened romance, the suggestion of forbidden love, and, more subtly, the framing of the whole thing as a curiosity, as a legend rather than as history, as a bit of local color rather than as the actual foundational story of a people who were, at that very moment, being pushed off their own land. Because that was happening at the same time. And you should know about it. The Klamath had signed a treaty with the United States in 1864, 1 year before Colvig heard the story from Chief Lalek. That treaty ceded roughly 20 million acres of Klamath land to the federal government in exchange for a reservation of about 2 million acres and the retention of hunting, fishing, and gathering rights. It was not a fair trade. It was made under the pressure of the era, with the memory of the Modoc War still fresh, the Modoc War in which a small band of 52 warriors, led by a man called Captain Jack, held off the United States Army for months in the lava beds south of Tule Lake, in what remains one of the most tactically remarkable indigenous resistances in the history of the American West. So, when William Gladstone Steele arrived at Fort Klamath in 1885 and heard the story from Chief Allen David, he was hearing it from a man who was living at that moment on a reservation that had been carved out of his own ancestral country. Lake Steele would spend the rest of his life turning into a national park was, from a Klamath perspective, still Klamath land. Ceremonially, spiritually, legally, under the terms of their treaty, still their land. The park did not care. It could not, structurally, care. In 1902, President Theodore Roosevelt signed the legislation creating Crater Lake National Park. It was the 6th national park in the United States. Steele had won his campaign. He had spent 17 years on it. But before the park was created, in the summer of 1896, there was a ceremony on the rim. This is the ceremony I told you would matter. It was called the Mazamas Convention, named for the new Alpine Club that Steele and his friends had founded in Portland the year before. Hundreds of people came. Politicians, geologists, journalists, climbers. They spent 3 weeks in the area. And at the end of that gathering, in a formal ritual, with fireworks set off on Wizard Island, they gave the vanished mountain its new name, Mount Mazama. That is the ceremony where the mountain was renamed, not by any decree or law or treaty, by a group of Portland enthusiasts using the name of their own hiking club in front of an audience of visitors, with pyrotechnics on the cinder cone at the western end of the water. The mountain that had been called Moyaina and Laoyaina and various forms of Tumsumne in the language of the people whose ancestors had watched it fall was now Mount Mazama, after a hiking club, founded 7 years earlier in Portland. I do not say this to be angry. I am not angry. I say it because it is a specific event, at a specific place, with a specific date, that changed the name of a landmark that had carried the same identity for something like 300 generations. And it was done cheerfully, in good faith, by people who thought of themselves, and I suspect actually were, as lovers of that landscape. This is how erasure usually works, not with hostility, with enthusiasm. The story I have been telling you about what the Klamath said was living beneath Crater Lake has, by this point in our narrative, by the year 1902, undergone a significant translation. Lao is still under there in the memory of the Klamath, but the Klamath themselves have been renamed as fearful, superstitious people who never approached the lake. The mountain has been renamed after a hiking club. The volcanic cinder cone in the middle has been renamed after a wizard's hat. The narrow cliff pinnacles at the southern end have been renamed the Phantom Ship, and the story of what fell and what remained has been rewritten as a doomed love story about a maiden named Loha. You would be forgiven if you visited Crater Lake in the year 1910 or 1930 or 1950 for having no clear sense that there were still Klamath people in the world, or that they still remembered the story, or that they still went when they could to the caldera. But they did. And in 1954, the United States Congress did something that made all of this considerably worse. Under a federal policy called termination, Congress declared that the Klamath tribes no longer existed as a federally recognized nation. Their reservation was liquidated. Their timber was sold. Their communal identity as a people was, on paper, dissolved. The reasoning at the time was that the Klamath had become successful enough as loggers and ranchers that they no longer needed the protection of tribal status. In practice, termination stripped them of their land base, their government-to-government relationship with the United States, and most of the tools they had used to protect their culture and their sacred places. Termination lasted for 32 years. During those years, the Klamath continued to hold their ceremonies, continued to teach their language, or what remained of it, continued to go quietly to Giwas. The park had rules against certain kinds of ceremonial use, but Klamath people went anyway. The lake was, in every meaningful sense, still theirs, even when the federal government said they did not exist. In 1986, after a decade of organized political work, the Klamath Restoration Act passed. On August 27th of that year, the Klamath tribes were federally recognized once again. Their land base was not restored. Most of what had been their reservation had by then become the Winnemem National Forest, but they were at least a nation again in the eyes of the government that had unmade them. That is why every fourth weekend in August, in the town of Killican, you can attend the restoration celebration. There's a parade. There's a POW wow. There are drum groups. The Steiger Butte Singers, one of whose members, Taylor Tupper, has spoken publicly about the connection her family holds to Giwas. There is Klamath language spoken openly, taught to children, encouraged in daily life. It is a small movement in a small town, in a corner of Oregon that most Americans have never visited. But it is happening. And this is where the story of what is living beneath Crater Lake gets its ending, or more accurately, does not. Because the answer, in Klamath thought, was never really about a monster. That was the outsider translation. The tourism brochure version. Lao, in the fuller telling, the version you get when you listen to a Klamath elder rather than a 19th century pamphlet, is not simply a demon buried under a lake. Lao is a specific presence, a being related to a specific mountain in a specific piece of country, watched by a specific people. His entrapment beneath the water is not a horror story. It is a cosmology. It is the reason the lake is the lake. It is why the people who have known it for 10,000 years say what they say when they go to its edge. We're told by our elders that it's not a place to go and mess around. That is Taylor Tupper again, quoted in a Bend newspaper a few years ago. It's a place to come for ceremony, or power, or if you need something. That is not a legend. That is a set of instructions for how to relate to a place. It is the same instructions the elders were giving 9,000 years ago. It is the instructions embedded in a story about a mountain that fell. The lake, seen with those eyes, is not blue because it is deep, or because it lacks silt, or because there are no rivers to carry sediment in. And those are true things, geologically, but they are not the reason. The reason it is that blue is because Lao is beneath it. He was pulled down when the mountain came down. He is held there by the mountain that fell on him. The color is the sign of his continued containment. It is the visible surface of an ongoing containment. And if a Klamath elder tells you, quietly, that certain things could happen if the containment slipped, that is not superstition. That is a comment on a volcanic system that is still, in geological terms, active. The mountain has erupted before. It will erupt again. Whether Lao is beneath it or magma is beneath it depends on which language you are speaking. Both languages describe something that is true, which brings me back to where we started. To the rim, at dawn. To the wind that smells like stone. To the water, so blue it looks painted. I said, at the beginning, that the people who have lived at the edge of this place for at least 10,000 years say something is beneath it. Something waiting? I want to change that now with what you know. The Klamath did not say something was waiting to attack them. They said something was there, in the water, held, part of the place. A neighbor in a certain sense, though not the kind of neighbor you invite for dinner. Someone who requires respect, someone whose presence is the reason for the blueness, and for the depth, and for the silence, and for the fact that no river flows in and none flows out, and every drop of water in the caldera was pulled from the sky. Liao is not a jump scare. Liao is a presence in a landscape that has been continuously inhabited by his people since before any pyramid was built. The men who came in the 1850s and the 1880s and the 1930s and the 1950s misheard this in 1,000 different ways. Some of them softened it into a fairy tale about a maiden. Some of them hardened it into a superstition to be pitied. Some of them buried it under new names: Mazama, wizard, witch, phantom, devil. Some of them, in the case of William Gladstone Steele, wrote entire sentences that were flat wrong and let those sentences drift into tourism copy for 100 years. But the story survived them. It survived them because the Klamath survived them. Termination did not end the Klamath. The renaming did not end the Klamath. The rewriting did not end the Klamath. There are 5,700 enrolled members today. There is Klamath spoken in Kiloquin schools. There are Klamath elders taking their grandchildren quietly to the caldera. There are cultural camps run at Gaiwas in the summer in which children who share DNA with the makers of those sagebrush sandals learn the names of things in the language their ancestors were speaking on the morning the mountain fell. If you drive to Crater Lake next summer, and if you park and walk to the rim and look down at the 2,000 feet of blue, you will not see Lao. You will not see anyone. There is not much to see, in the way sight usually works. The lake is enormous and calm and quiet in a way that makes people go silent when they arrive. Even the tourists go silent. There is something about that particular blue that shuts a person up. But the story is there, underneath, where it has always been. The mountain came down. Lao went with it, and the people who watched it happen carried the memory mouth to ear, for what is now something like 9,000 years. They carried it through Hillman and Kolvig and Steele. They carried it through termination and restoration. They still carry it. And they will keep carrying it in a language that was not written down until men from Switzerland and the Bureau of American Ethnology started trying to spell it, and even then, only in fragments. What did the Klamath say was living beneath Crater Lake? They said their neighbor. A being who was there before their people came, and who is there still, and who will be there when their great-great-grandchildren are old. A being whose containment gives the water its color. A being whose presence, if you are Klamath, is not a myth and not a metaphor, but a specific way of describing the fact that you live at the edge of a place where the earth once opened and something enormous went below the surface and did not come back. That is what they said. That is what they say now. That is what their elders will say to their children next summer at cultural camp, at the edge of the caldera, in the same wind that has been blowing off that water for 70 centuries. The wind that comes up off the lake and does not smell like water. That smells like stone, and the stone smells old.